But as your book does, I'm going to digress and talk about Greek culture. Writing of history. Herodotus is said to be the father of history, not because he was the first person to write history, far from it, but because he, in his writing, left out a lot of these, I want to say stuff that we call supernatural. He didn't leave it all out. He did have a lot of intervention by the gods and a lot of other things that we modern people, a lot of us do not like. But he left out a lot of the religious or supernatural events. The next historian after him was Thucydides, who left out even more. His writings were even more secular. Now what you find, folk, and you're going to see this when it comes to the philosophers, is their philosophy was becoming more secular as time went on. In other words, they started out being extremely spiritual and then got less and less spiritual and more, and you notice my hand goes down when I say that. Maybe it shows my personal belief that as they got more secular and less spiritual, they were actually declining. Now, folk, they only went on for a certain amount of time. They spent about 5 or 6 generations becoming more and more secular, and all of a sudden they reversed and became more spiritual than ever. But now, Herodotus did not just write a history of Greece. He wrote a history of the world as he understood it. His history even includes the Jews, the Assyrians coming down and taking the Jews captive. He wrote about the history of the Persian Empire, and a lot of what we know about Persia has come from him, because the Persian writings, if they existed, they wrote on paper or scans or something that hasn't come down to us. But Herodotus' writings have been copied and recopied and recopied down through the last 2,400 or so years, to where he has taught us most of what we know about the Persian Empire. But he actually tried to write history from the beginning of time as he understood it. So he is called the father of history. Thucydides did the same thing, except he was even more secular than was Herodotus. Thucydides is also known for his cyclical view of history. He believed that history tended to repeat itself. Now, folks, this is something a lot of people wonder about. Does history sometimes repeat itself? Perhaps on occasion. I see one head nodding pretty strongly, pretty firmly. You think it does? Yeah, perhaps so. As these things go in cycles, and he noticed that the Greeks would sometimes try a monarchy, then the monarch, they didn't like it, so they would trade a monarchy for an aristocracy for a tyranny for democracy, and then from democracy they could wind up going back to the tyranny again. So these things sometimes went in cycles. Greek drama. Now, folks, let me correct something. I said that I'm not going to pay that much attention to arts. That does not apply to Greece. With Greek, I'm very interested in Greek art, Greek literature. I've studied it more than I have the literature of other countries. So with Greek, well, we'll start with Greek drama, and then go from Greek art. Greek drama features a lot of what we might call tragedies, fatalism, now I remember as a kid watching the old westerns on the old black and white TV. Most of them probably don't know what I'm talking about. At one time, almost every evening, all they had on for hours and hours in the evenings was westerns. And they'd jump from one western to another. And the hero of the western program never got killed, never got beat up, was always in the right, was always on top of every situation. And finally, someone even wrote to Reader's Digest that your hero should get chased clear across the Mexican border one time, should get really badly wounded. But anyway, but in a tragedy is a story where the hero is killed. And oftentimes because the gods will it. That God would make a statement, a prediction, and there was no way we could prevent that prediction. Now, one of the most famous ones is the case of Oedipus. I don't think I spelled that right, but Oedip? Okay. Someone had visited the oracle of Apollo that was at Delphi in Greece, and Apollo had told him that this man is going to grow up and marry his mother. Well, they did everything they could to keep young Oedipus away from his mother, but finally Oedipus grew up, and unknown to himself, without knowing it, he married his mother, and his mother didn't know that it was her son. I mean, they'd been kept apart. So they married, as was told, and also Oedipus died a tragic death, again, as was told by his son. Actually, he killed his father first, married his mother, all without realizing that the person he was killing was his father and the woman he was marrying was his mother. Again, this was because the gods had decreed it. What's that?
Yes.
Say that again?
Yes.
I don't know the answer, but some of you seem to have heard the story. How many have heard this story? Okay, several of you. Oh, yes. Now, folk, there's a limit to how filthy I like to get, but the story of it led to Sigmund Freud developing what he called the Oedipus complex, where the person, a young man, would have more than a natural liking for his mother. And supposedly Sigmund Freud himself had an Oedipus complex. All right, having said that, I'll leave that topic. Anyway, some of you might have heard that about Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology. He got into the field of psychology, folks, because he wanted to solve his own problems, which is why a whole lot of psychologists in the field, they want to solve their own problems. Freud was no exception. All right, anyway, the tragedy eventually gave way to the comedy. The Greeks developed the comedy. Also, the Greeks were the first people that I know of, one of the first to put their act on a stage. You know, it's to have what we call theater. And eventually theater led to curtains, and they developed a huge, what you call amphitheater. It was a whole bunch of stone seats to where people could sit on layers, like you do grandstands at a ball game today. And they didn't need a public address system because a person standing at the right location could talk in a normal tone of voice, and because of the stadium reflecting your sound all over the place, you could be heard by everyone. Even up to 4,000 or 5,000 persons could be heard all over the place by simply reflection of voice, without electronic PA systems. All right, the arts. The Greeks in their art strove for realism. In other words, they would brag that I can make a statue of an apple that looks so real that a deer will come up and try to eat it. Now today we don't strive for that kind of realism. We say leave realism to the camera. But you can go to Crystal and see sandwiches so real looking that you almost feel like you bite into them. Again, that, of course, those pictures are cameras. But today's artists say, no, we try to paint moods, try to paint joy, sadness, love, hate, fear. And we use what we call abstract art, or modern art, and try to paint emotion rather than realism, and leave realism to the camera. But the Greeks, unlike us, strove for realism. They also strove to create what they called the ideal body. Now, I had someone ask me when I was 12 years old, and I didn't know the answer, but why did the Greeks always show their gods, make their god statues with them naked? The answer is, they wanted to show that these gods had what they thought was the ideal body. So the Greek body was a broad-shouldered man with somewhat of a slender waist and very, very muscular. And later on, the writers of the Superman comics was to make their character Superman with the body of a Greek god. Now, the Superman, you might not realize he has some connection with Nazi Germany. Nietzsche believed that we were going to eventually use evolution to create a race of Supermen where that everybody would have an ideal body like that of a Greek god. And every woman, you might say, might look like Lois Lane or whatever, but every woman, everybody would be a scientist, and everybody would be healthy, and everybody would be happy, and we'd all look basically alike. In fact, now, a man named Adolf Hitler, I think you all know who I'm talking about, said, I have seen the man of the future. And the man of the future looks like the Greek gods of the past. Again, ideal. Now, when I was a kid, I'd read the Superman books. They'd have these Charles Atlas ads. Maybe some of you have seen them. They have two models, one called the before and one called the after. I used to use a magnifying glass to try to figure out, are they using the same model? They were accused of using two different men to model, the one to the before and a different man to model the after. The before was either a man who was altogether too skinny, scrawny, or puny, and the after, or sometimes they used a man who was too overweight, too obese. The after was a perfectly developed man. They said, in 7 weeks I went from this to this. Now, today most of us don't believe that, because again, we suspect that they were using two separate models. But Charles Atlas was famous for claiming that he could build a body just like the one shown in the after in his ads. And we do have some of his books. He sold for $5 a piece, and he emphasized isometrics. He called it dynamic tension. Today we realize motion is the best way to do it, but we've also learned something else apparently he didn't know, or you men. Unless you were born with the right genes, you cannot build the body he described. You had to have been born with it. And try, if you don't have a gene for the right big bulging biceps, all the exercising you can do is not going to build it up. If you want to argue with that, go ahead. Anybody? Yeah.
All of their statues are anatomically correct. All the measurements they over-exaggerated the parts that they wanted to.
Who's that?
All of the Greek.
The Greeks?
Greeks.
Perhaps, yeah. Well, again, their gods may have been a little bit more than human also.
Well, just the representation of their statues, how they said they wanted, and even the perfect humans as well, not just the gods. But
okay.
All the measurements are not correct.
Yeah, good point.
Anatomically
Good point.
wrong.
Anyway, Hitler again tried to copy this ideal. All right, folk. With this, I've just about caught you up with where the other class is. Oh yeah, one thing I want to mention, don't learn them, but they developed the columns. And again, don't learn the word Doric, Iconic, or Corinthian. I mean, there were different types of columns. But know this, their temples did not have walls. Their temples, their ceiling was held up by the columns, and the wind could blow right through their temples, and the inside of the temples then had the same temperature as the outside. And if you had a really strong rain, it was blowing with a rain side to side instead of straight down, you could get soaking wet by going into their temple, unless you went deep enough into it. The most famous temple was the Parthenon, and unfortunately in the late 1600s, somebody was storing gunpowder in the Parthenon during one of their wars, and the gunpowder went off and did a lot of damage to the Parthenon, which was never repaired. But the Parthenon remained really beautiful for something like 1800 or so years. Really beautiful piece of artwork. All right, this takes us up to philosophy. One of my favorite topics. And folk, with 3 minutes, I can't cover it, but we'll take up here. But wait, before we leave, one thing I want to say about philosophy. Some of the stuff is issues that we debate today, and some of it may seem to be far-fetched at first. But as we look into it deeper about, hey, how did they know some of this stuff? For instance, you had one philosopher who said that everything could be explained by water. Oh yeah, the Greek philosopher Thales. That's it. Everything without. Today's scientists will say, well, it looks like the universe started out with hydrogen. If you know what water is two atoms of hydrogen mixed with one of oxygen, and you have water. Again, how did the Greeks know this, or was it just merely a guess? But they believe that the universe started out with water, and some of the water got transformed into lead, and some of it got transformed into other metals, some of it got transformed into rock, and some of the rock got transformed into dirt, so on and so forth. Now, I will say this and I'll close. Pythagoras believed that everything about the universe could be found in two things, music and numbers. Have any of you ever heard that in music, every eighth note repeats the first one? You have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. C to C is one octave. In the periodic table of elements, which is found in the chemistry classes here, every eighth element copies the first one. Have any of you heard this? Music, chemistry. I mean, I'm not saying about everything becoming one united field, folk. The Greeks believed it could be done, and from that day to this, our science has been trying to unite every field of knowledge and explain everything into one field. So that Einstein called the unified field theory. Today we call it the TOE, T-O-E, or theory of everything. Folks, the sophists wound up saying there's some things we can't explain, but the difference between them and me, I think we should try because we don't know what we can explain, what we can't. The sophists said we can't explain the universe, it's foolish to try. With that, I'll leave you. When we come back Wednesday, we'll talk about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle.